Hello, everyone. This is the very first webinar by the Nordic EV Summit. I am Christina Bu, the Secretary General of the Norwegian EV Association. We organize EV drivers in Norway, more than 75,000.
And I am Jan Moberg. I'm the CEO and the editor-in-chief of TU Media, the leading tech publisher here in Norway. We cooperate on these events. And we should have been over 1,000 delegates in Oslo today and tomorrow. Due to the pandemic, we aren't able to pull that one off. We quite don't know when we can accommodate that size of a group with EV enthusiasts right now, but we'll keep you informed.
While we're waiting for more normal times, we are happy to have so many of you participating. Probably not that many Norwegians because we have a very good weather here in Oslo today, 20 degrees and really sunny. So the Norwegians are probably sunbathing or eating ice cream right now, Jan.
Well, yes, out of the darkness and out of the cold, we are going crazy when the weather's like this. It's actually warmer here than it is in Greece right now. So that's very good. Sunbathing, eating ice cream and all that right now. The rest of us, however, will be discussing another hot topic.
Yes, because the COVID-19 pandemic has hit the whole world. An unprecedented crisis, really, which is, of course, also affects the car industry. So we are very interested in learning more about how specifically it is or will impact the much needed electrification of our transport. Will it suffer or benefit?
And to hopefully answer some of those questions, we have some very knowledgeable people joining us today, some leading EV experts. So let's just start and welcome our first two guests, Colin McCarricker and Julia Poliskanova. Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Everybody, good to be here.
First to you, Colin. You are the head of advanced transport at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. You cover the future of mobility and advise world's top authorities, electric utilities, oil and gas companies, governments, and of course also investors. Topics include EVs, batteries, infrastructure for charging, shared mobility and autonomy. Would you like to start with a small introduction about EVs and how the case of electrification is developing?
Yeah, that sounds great. So I'm going to share some slides. And I think what I'll do is for the opening part, I'll talk about sort of where we are today and the trajectory we're on electrification. And then we'll use the discussion part afterwards to go into more depth on what we think the impact of COVID are. And as was mentioned, does it improve things or does it slow things down? So first, let me just share my screen. That will work. Let me just bring that up to full screen. Is that okay? Can everybody see that? Christina, can you see that okay?
Perfectly.
Yes.
Great. So again, just to kind of set the scene, because I think as we ask these questions about what impact COVID will have, we really need to understand the sort of trajectory that we're on up till this point. So that's going to be the main focus of these slides, and then we'll come on to the other topics. And I know Julia has a lot to add as well. One of the important things to take stock of is just kind of where we are. So there were a little over 7 million electric vehicles on the road at the end of last year. And prior to all of this, we were forecasting around just over 10 million on the road at the end of this year. That's probably going to be closer to 9 million. So you can imagine how that chart drops off, and we're updating these right now. But still, that's pretty remarkable growth when you consider that there were almost none of these on the road in 2012. So we've gone through this period of really remarkable growth, and whether it's 9 or 10, that part of the story should change. Another part of the story that doesn't really change is the number of models available. So by the end of 2020, there'll be almost 500 different EV models available globally. Now, not all of these are available in every market. Of course, a large chunk of these are just in China, but we've seen very steady improvements to the number and range of models that are being offered. So across most vehicle segments now, there are electrified options, and increasingly from all the different manufacturers, there are electrified options. And battery electrics, of course, are the largest portion of those zero emissions capable vehicles. You do see a good number of plug-in hybrids also coming, particularly in Europe, and also more of them coming in China. Most of the new models that are launching are purely electric. The other thing that's going on in the background, of course, and if you've ever seen a Bloomberg NEF presentation before, you've probably seen us talk a lot about battery technology. That's something where we've been tracking for a long time. And one of the things you see when you track that is that there has been this very steady increase in the average energy density of lithium-ion batteries as we go to different battery chemistries, and those are cathode chemistries on the right and in different colors. We've seen a very steady improvement. So this has also gone up quite dramatically over the last few years. On a volume-weighted basis, it goes up at about 5 to 6% per year for what's actually going into vehicles, but that's starting to compound quite a bit. And that's why you're getting some vehicles that over the years that have had relatively similar form factors are getting very steady increases to their range. So vehicles like the Renault Zoe are playing a big part, are exhibiting that trend quite well. And of course, battery prices are down really dramatically. So about 87% from 2010 to 2019. We still think they're going to keep falling this year despite the coronavirus impacts. If anything, you might see some real cutthroat competition on the manufacturing side as battery manufacturers look to compete in a world that probably has more supply than demand. So overall, we think that coming down, and we think there's further room for decline, not just in the cathode as you'd expect, but also in other parts of the pack. So we can see a route to significant improvements in cell prices at the pack level, but also overall pack prices. So we think those are going to keep coming down. What we sort of see when we model this, and each one of those blue triangles is a historic price, we can see a pretty clear path based on the current technologies to getting around $100 a kilowatt hour at the pack level. And that's broadly where you need for unsubsidized EVs to be upfront cost competitive with internal combustion engine vehicles. Now that varies a fair bit by segment. If you look at really small cars, or you look at markets where the average purchase price is quite low, so say India, then you need significantly below $100 a kilowatt hour. But at 100, you start competitive. Below about 100 in terms of where we think the technology is going, then you need more significant advancements to get down to this sort of $70 or $80 a kilowatt hour at the pack level. We still think that's achievable by 2030, but you're probably going to need some significant jumps in the underlying battery chemistry in order to do that. There are a wide range of competing options that are advancing at different rates that we think will enable that, but it's a bit hard to pick exactly what those are going to be. So there's a clear glide path down to around 100, and then beyond that is a little. The other thing that's been improving really dramatically, again, that COVID doesn't stop, is around average ranges. So the average range of a battery electric vehicle launched in 2012 was around 170 kilometers. The average range of a BEV launching this year, and each one of those circles is an individual model, and each one of the colors is based on the region that it's launched in. That's already up close to 400 kilometers for the battery electric vehicles launching this year. And that's real world range. Those are all converted, or very close to real world range. Those are all converted to the EPA test cycle. So that's actually close to what people get in rig. The other thing that's also changing is charging speeds. So you may have seen us present this before sometimes as well. These are the maximum charging rates of different models launched up until 2018. And that's some of the ones that are launching last year, this year, and into next year. So what you see is a significant jump from sort of a peak of around 100 for quite a few vehicles to 150, establishing itself as somewhat the new norm, but then also some premium vehicles going all the way up to 350. Now, most of the charging infrastructure can't support 350 yet, but it shows that the vehicles are still improving. And I think that's quite an important point when we think about what happens with COVID, is that when we look at the longer term trajectory, we are not at the end of how good an EV can be. And I think that's a very important point to keep in mind, is things are still improving. The underlying technology is still improving. The proposition to customers is improving. We're also seeing that 350 kilowatt charging starting to move down market. So that was traditionally, or the last few years, the announcements that we've seen on it have been only at very high-end vehicles. Hyundai Kia have announced that starting in 2021, some of their EVs will be equipped with an 800-volt system so they can support up to 350 kilowatt charging. So that shows that isn't just going to stay at the highest end vehicles. Again, there are real challenges around how you integrate that into the grid and how you support that from the charging infrastructure as well. But still, that again indicates that we're probably going to see more vehicles. And almost lastly, the number of charging stations is still rising really quickly. So at the end of 2019, there were almost 1 million public charging points globally. That is, again, really improving the proposition to end consumers. There is still a lot of fragmentation, both in terms of the physical standards and also the sort of business part of it, the networks and roaming and collaboration between them. But there are various initiatives that are trying to improve that. So we think that will start to improve over the next few years, though it is still a bit of an issue. But overall, the number of chargers, public charging stations, has gone up really rapidly in the last few years. So if we just kind of summarize, and again, thinking of this as the trajectory, and then we talk about the COVID part more, the 2010s were really all about if electric mobility takes off. The 2020s are all about when and where. The 2010s were much more about direct purchase subsidies, and now we're moving to more indirect policy mechanisms, things like fuel economy regulations and CO2 targets that are really going to drive the market forward. The 2010s were much more about increasing performance. Now we're going to see a lot of emphasis around reducing price to try and get these out to a much wider audience. It was also much more focused in the last 10 years around passenger vehicles. I think you're going to see a lot more action on different segments. So we're already seeing that on buses, already seeing that on two-wheelers. I think you're going to see that much more on delivery vans, on ride-hailing vehicles, and other special purpose vehicles over the next 10 years. Infrastructure was a hurdle through most of the 2010s, and it still is to some degree, but you're seeing more and more groups thinking of infrastructure more as an opportunity than as a hurdle. And finally, the 2010s had a lot of supply uncertainty. It was all about tracking which automakers might launch an EV, who was going to have an electrification program. Now we know pretty much every automaker is going to have a significant EV program. But the questions are around where the demand is, in which segments, in which countries, and around which timeframes. So hopefully that provides a good starting point for thinking about where we go in terms of the impact of COVID. I think with that, I'll hand off to Julia, and then we can talk a bit more about how we think the next sort of 18 months and 2 years plays out, and any long-term impacts of COVID as well.
Thank you, Colin. That was very interesting, and I think a very good starting point. So let's move on to Julia. Julia, you are the Director of Clean Vehicles and E-Mobility at Transport and Environment, direct from your home in Brussels, I presume. You have previously worked for the Mayor of London and in the European Parliament before joining Transport and Environment. So you know EU politics, but you're a bit of a tech nerd too. You recently obtained a Master of Science degree in energy engineering, specializing in batteries and fuel cells. We would have loved to discuss batteries more as well, but for now we will mostly discuss or focus on whether the crisis might soften the restrictions on emissions in the EU. And I think that your presentation that you will look into this. So thank you, Julia. We're excited to hear you speak.
Thanks very much. Thanks for this great introduction. I hope everyone can see my screen now as well.
Yes.
Great, it works. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a real shame not to be in Oslo for this fantastic opportunity, but it's great we can connect and discuss digitally in any case, and I think that's great that it's possible these days. So I'll spend a bit of time, so we still have time for discussion, to look a bit more at electric car future and the emission rules here in Europe. But I think a lot of this is very much relevant to global discussions as well. A really quick word, as TNE, we are a European group of NGOs. These are all our members. We represent Green Campaigns group, but I think some of them would be very familiar to you all across Europe. So 2020 was touted as the year of the electric car in Europe and globally, and I think Colin made a great introduction to really outline how and where and why it's happening. A little bit quickly, maybe just to show that we really have seen booming electric car sales in Europe. Hundreds of models are now being on offer by pretty much every car maker. So the choice is finally there. That was not the case before this year. And really crucially on the right, you can really see how the production of electric cars has been ramping up all across Europe or in some of the key countries. So this and next year, there's a lot of industrial momentum there as well to produce cars, some batteries and the supply chain. The reason for this are the European CO2 emission standards here in Europe. From 1st of January this year, most of car makers' cars, or 95% of their sales, have to be under the average target of 95 grams per kilometer. Next year, all cars have to meet that standard. So this has really been the driver for this. The question is, what impact has COVID-19 had on that? And I tried to summarize here and put on my slide some of the thinking that we started to develop as transport, as an environment, as the situation, of course, develops. Based on what we know today, we believe that there is no reason to weaken or cancel the current CO2 standards. And actually, this is also something that has been supported by a number of car makers. The Volkswagen Group, BMW, Peugeot and Daimler all came out publicly to say that we shouldn't touch the CO2 targets. What is really crucial to mention here is that the target, the way it's designed, is actually a fleet average target. So it doesn't matter how many cars you sell. Not that I wish it to any car maker, but in a simple terms, even if you sell 10 cars, as long as one of them is electric, you are complying. So COVID-19 as itself and its ramifications do not impact compliance. What impacts is what cars continue to be sold. And there are a lot of positive signs in that regard. You can see the graph here on the left where we have tried to pull together the latest sales data that we can find. And actually, the electric car sales were absolutely soaring all across Western Europe in the first quarter of this year. Actually, in March, the highest ever on record sales were recorded in Germany, France, and the UK, which are the largest markets of cars in Europe. Most cars are sold on leasing contracts to companies. Actually, most cars in Europe are sold to companies, big and small, not to private customers. But this is the market that with the right incentives can continue, and I will come to that later. But this is still possible. Very crucially, maybe just to say here that a lot of car makers in the first months of this year were already compliant, even before they were bringing new models on the market. So before ID.3 or new E500. So that's also quite important. And it shows that the demand actually is there. And with the right incentives, and when you give consumers a good choice of performing models, people will buy these cars. So instead of weakening the regulations, we say we should put in place all these green stimulus programs in such a way that they target e-mobility and continue the momentum and enable the electric car market to continue developing. This has also been the message of a large number of companies. You see here on the screen, cities as well, and many other associations, including ourselves. We sent a letter to the Commission President to say exactly that, because there has also been letters by the car industry asking for something slightly different. So therefore, to really put the message there, let's keep the targets, but let's focus all our state and public investment we now do on green investment. A few points here. I think it's really important to say that now all the production came to a halt. And as car makers bring back one by one their individual factories, the green investment signal is very strong to make them prioritize what production lines they open first. There's been some positive signals. Volkswagen opened a Zwickau plant where they produce ID.3 as one of the first ones. Renault today announced that they're opening Flints plant where they make Renault Zoe. So this is a signal, and we should really ensure that that continues. And secondly and lastly, I think we absolutely must give consumers the right signal. I think all of us on a lockdown got a bit of a glimpse of what our city can be like and what our air quality can be like without polluting combustion engines. So instead of spending limited public cash to give people cars that cities actually want to ban in the next few years, we should put in place very clear targeted state aid programs, be it scrappage schemes or tax rebates that focus on zero emission models. on electric cars. And I think that's really, really important. And that will enable and put together our climate, industrial, and economic recovery policy into the right Green Deal route. So with that, I look forward to the discussion, and I would be very keen to see how you see the future of e-mobility post-COVID. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. This was very interesting. And talking about the local pollution, many cities have really reduced emissions. And I also heard that Harvard had done a study showing that the risk of dying from COVID-19 is actually 20 times higher if you live in a city with high pollution levels. So it's actually a lot of good reasons when discussing recovery packages to strengthen, have a focus on electrification. But I also heard the news today that China is actually now cutting back a little bit. Was the news today? I don't know if you heard. But is your general? Do you think that? Are you really so hopeful when it comes to the EU? Do you really think that nothing will happen? You mentioned some of the car manufacturers, but there are also others. It must be discussed, I guess. Do you have anything to add? No, I'm mute.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes. Just a few quick remarks here. Absolutely, it is part of the discussion. I think there has been now a large amount of letters and statements by politicians on all sides asking for recovery to be green, so to put the money in line with Green Deal. However, I think it's important not to just use grand words like green, but to go into detail. What does green mean? And we haven't seen enough of that yet at European level. So everyone says clean cars, but what is a clean car? Maybe for someone a new diesel is a clean car, and we would argue as Transport Environment it's not. So what is missing is a very clear and targeted discussion about what do we mean when we mean green recovery. What the only powers European Commission really has is to tell member states what is allowed state aid and what isn't. So they can just put a condition saying, for example, in Germany, you can only give scrappage schemes to electric cars. If that doesn't happen, we really lose the momentum and lose the possibility to target that all countries put in place all the different stimulus in line with e-mobility.
Julia, when you say this, I get a feeling that the low oil prices that we're currently in will not have the impact that I might fear.
So maybe Colin.
Price of oil is cheap. It was to you, Julia, and I would think that then the fossil industry could strike back, but because of these policies, that won't happen. Is how I interpret it.
Absolutely. I think when we talk about the oil price, what we actually looked at is a total cost of ownership of vehicles. And actually in Europe, where electric cars are already better on the total cost of ownership basis, a lot of price or impact from fuels actually comes from taxation. So taxation is so high that even big jumps in fuel prices don't have such a big impact. But more importantly, I think, is that with low oil price, there's much less interest in the industry to go and recover and explore more and more oil. And on the contrary, a lot of renewable projects are becoming much more viable. So I think longer term, we will experience the decline of the oil industry sector and the revival and even bigger push for electrification in our economy.
Do you have anything to add, Colin?
Yeah, I can give some thoughts on this. So our view at Bloomberg NEF is that the biggest hurdle to EV adoption has always still been the high upfront cost and not a total cost of ownership issue for private consumers. So with that in mind, battery prices matter more than oil prices, right? So if battery prices keep coming down, EV adoption will keep going up. If battery prices don't keep coming down, EV adoption may stall. I think the oil price probably has a very different impact in different parts of the world. So for example, China puts a price floor on the retail fuel price, regardless of the underlying commodity price. So when oil goes below a certain level, the pump price does not necessarily go below that certain level. There's a floor on it. So that means the end consumer is only exposed to some degree of that drop in oil price. Similarly, as Julia has mentioned, Europe, there's a lot of taxation that blunts that impact as well. The place where you might see a bigger impact is probably the US. I think also the other question is around whether we're talking about private individuals or whether we're talking about commercial vehicles and operators. And low oil prices do matter for commercial fleets and operators, right? Whether it's a bus or a delivery van or an Uber driver, that's actually quite an important factor. So I think the challenge is that those are also some of the vehicles that account for a disproportionately high amount of urban pollution and urban air quality problems. So the challenge is that I don't think low oil prices will impact private consumers as much as people think, particularly in markets like Europe and China. But I think they may impact the commercial fleet operators a little bit more, who do think more on a total cost of ownership. So I think governments have to think about how they balance that to prevent sort of the worst outcomes, because we're probably looking at a world, at least for a little while, where there is a significant increase in the amount of e-commerce and the amount of delivery vehicles around in city streets. And as you mentioned, because of the health impacts, potential health impacts there's a few more studies showing that, and this link seems to be getting stronger. Those are certainly things you want to tackle.
Question to you, Colin. With all your beautiful graphs and specs, I was curious as to the effect of battery lifetime, because now we are getting some EVs going out of use, and our learning so far has been that the batteries actually last longer than we thought. Is that going to have any impact at all?
Yeah, I think so far what we have seen is that we talked to a lot of the groups trying to do battery recycling, large format battery recycling from EVs, and we've done a lot of work talking to them, and most of them sort of said, look, we're ready, we just need some volume. There's not enough of them to recycle because they're all lasting quite a long time. You're just starting to see that change. So you're starting to see some places in China recycling reasonable volumes. So some of those really big e-bus deployments, a few of those intensely used vehicles, you're starting to see some batteries come out of those. I think longer battery lifetime, as long as the battery lasts as long as the vehicle for a private consumer, it doesn't matter so much. Where it might make a really big difference, I think, is on the commercial vehicle side, because some of those vehicles, especially in trucking, can put on a lot of kilometers, and that's where you might see a really big impact. You'll also see probably an impact on better residual values of the second generation or third generation of electric vehicles. So the first generation had pretty poor residual values. Some of the worst performing residual values in the US market, for example, were EVs over the last 10 years. But that's starting to change. You're starting to see, look, Tesla vehicles have very high residual values. Some of the other ones are starting to show better residual values. Lifetime there. In that case, that's actually linked to a battery management system approach that most groups have moved away from, a more simplified battery management system that led to higher levels of degradation in things like the early Nissan Leaf. But I think generally that could help with the residual value question, which, to be honest, is still something that's holding people back in some parts of the market. So I think that is part of the story, and I think we will see steady improvements on that.
We have to move on very soon, but a last question to the both of you. How do you see the market develop after COVID, whenever that is? Do you think it will soar, or how are you positive when it comes to EVs, of course?
Julia, do you want to go first?
I'll say very quickly. I think from what we've seen and what I've showed, there's been unprecedented record sales of electric cars in the first quarter. So what I think we will see very low volumes of car sales overall. They will absolutely slump, but we will still continue to see a healthy 5 to 7% EV share in the market throughout the year, which will, in some cases, make some car makers even over-comply with the CO2 standards this year. Because people actually don't buy polluting diesel SUVs in times of crisis. I think that's an important consideration.
Yeah, I think we'll see EVs as a percentage hold up slightly better globally than overall vehicles, which is somewhat counterintuitive, right? If you talk to most conventional auto analysts, they would say, look, EVs skew more expensive on average, therefore they will be worse hit by this. But I think overall, the auto market's going to have probably its worst year ever, or biggest drop ever this year. The EV share might hold up better because we have this backlog of orders. There's some built up demand, and also the regulations, as Julia mentioned. I think one of the big questions we're looking at is what form does stimulus take in different parts of the world? And already you've seen China indicate that one of the strategic areas it's going to focus some of its stimulus to get out of this COVID slump on is public charging infrastructure. So there's probably going to be a very big build out of that there. I think I'm optimistic that Europe will also continue to push hard on this. The place where I'm maybe a little bit less optimistic, and it probably depends on what happens with the federal election, is the US this year. If the current administration is reelected, I'm not very optimistic on large amounts of EV sales growth in the US. That market is almost entirely carried by Tesla today. So I think we have a very different patchwork emerging in different parts of the world, probably that broadly corresponds to the politics and trajectory that these markets were on beforehand. Once we get out of this COVID-induced drop that I think lasts for EVs probably the next 12 to 18 months. But I do think percentage adoption will probably hold up reasonably well, as Julia says, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world too.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting, and I can add that in Norway, the total market share for full electric cars so far this year in Norway is a bit higher than last year, actually. So we're optimistic. Okay, let's move on to our two next speakers.
Yes, we're going into the second half of the program with another two very interesting representatives from the EV industry, Thomas Ingenlath and Mats Harborn. Welcome. How do you do?
Hi. Good.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Do we have Mats with us as well?
Yes, I'm with you.
Perfect.
Yeah, very good.
Perfect. Okay, so let's start with you, Thomas. You are the CEO of Polestar, a car brand that no one really had heard about a few years back. You are originally a car designer and have worked for different car manufacturers, several Volkswagen brands, before you joined Volvo in 2012 and then started as the CEO of Polestar in 2017. When Volvo announced Polestar would begin producing high-end electric performance cars under its own name and badge. I'm eager to see the fully electric Polestar 2 on the roads. And we hear that you are still, or maybe you will tell us, whether you're still planning to start customer deliveries this summer, despite the pandemic. Please, would you like to start off with a small introduction?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation, and I hope sound and everything's okay.
Very good.
Good. Yeah, not people hadn't heard about this company because basically it didn't exist a couple of years ago. Yes, there was a Polestar brand tuning Volvos, but the idea and the change of founding a company that is purely dedicated to produce electric vehicles only was 4 years ago on the agenda, and since then we have built up Polestar, and indeed we are on our way producing the Polestar 2, which started a very slow pace in February, had a short break then in March, and the production has picked up now in April, and we are producing these cars, which are indeed coming to Europe, to Norway, and Swedish and Norway customers will be the first ones around end of June, July, getting their Polestar 2. Well, you can imagine us being in this very important phase of the company, really coming out with our first full electric battery car, and COVID-19 happening, becoming such a tremendous effect since the beginning of the year. That was indeed a very big impact and question for us as a company as well. We had to learn, and we are still learning, how to operate and run a company that is so spread out in the world, with production in China, with being present in the US, in Europe, and in China, how to manage this. But so far, as a lot of other people, we learn that it is possible, and it is despite the fact that nobody of us is flying at the moment and traveling. It's amazing how much you can accomplish this new way. Yes, and of course I'm following as well the debate of the politicians here as well. Some of the industry colleagues asking for this or that, connected to the topic how much the electrification journey will be affected by COVID-19 or not. And I'm very grateful for the initiative of a green comeback, because I think that would be such a missed opportunity of not using that moment to actually rather accelerate our journey than to slow it down. We were on our way to Geneva with exactly such a message. We were actually outspoken about how much we would be in a way tired of going to a car show and again discuss electrification, and how much it is in a way tedious to think that still after all these years we would have to answer all these questions about does it make sense. I mean, mentally we are that much further, and we wish society and industry and everybody would be that much further. So indeed what we need and what we should do now is really fully embrace it and go ahead with electrification.
Thank you. Very interesting, and we'll move on to Mats.
Yeah, let me introduce Mats Harborn, the Executive Director at Scania China Strategic Office. Mats, you've taken on the task of pushing heavy-duty trucks in China. This involves both legislation, standards, and best practices. You've been at this for almost 10 years, from what I understand. Let's hear the latest from the world's biggest heavy-duty markets for EVs.
Thank you. Well, when we talk electrification, of course, China is on top of everybody's mind, because it is, of course, the initiatives in China that started driving the development of electrification. And 99% of all electric buses operated in the world today are in China. The biggest bus fleet is down in the southern city of Shenzhen, just north of Hong Kong, which now has electrified the whole city bus fleet and also its taxis. So things are happening really fast in China. We are working together, for example, with a company called Higer. We can see that there are two different approaches really to developing new technologies. Our friends at Higer are today already at their 4th generation electric bus, and is moving towards the 5th. Of course, our Western approach is we are doing much more research before we release a product. When we release the product, we want it to be economic and stable for the customers. In China, the customer is a bit more, I would say, patient and accepts that vehicles are put on the road in a way as applied research. But what is then driving this enormous force in China? Well, perhaps a bit surprising is that the biggest driver is not the climate, it is energy security. China wants to make sure that it's less dependent on imported energy. Second one is clean air in the cities, and this is the middle class asking for better quality of life. Another very strong driver is the technological leapfrogging in China. And we all know about the China manufacturing in 2025 policy, where China wants to climb the value chains in a number of industries, including automotive. So there is a focus on what is called here the new energy vehicles. That's a term that I personally don't like so much, because energy is not new. It's the way we use energy. And we think that we can use also traditional energies in a much smarter way. The 4th driving factor, and the last one, is the climate change. What I think China is doing well is that it is in parallel with this, it is also working with its energy systems to increase the green content of it through solar, wind, hydro, where China is actually leading. And it is investing heavily into the charging infrastructure, and it is experimenting with smart roads. Apart from the buses I mentioned, we also see now China putting applied research on municipal vehicles. We see more and more such on the roads in China. We even see dumpers in the southern city of Shenzhen, airport vehicles and so on. What we are doing here, we're having a discussion with the authorities about what is the right energy for the right application. And we would like to see that the subsidies or the stimulus is used in a technology agnostic way. What impresses us when we look at China is also the integrated approach they take. It's not only about electrification, it's also how to work with electrification, autonomous driving, and intelligent and connected vehicles. And that is something I think we could learn from in the West, maybe. Now, going to the corona crisis, we all heard the news that the economy contracted by 6.8% in the first quarter. So what is China doing? The news was out just now, a few minutes ago, that it will now delay the phase out of its subsidies for electric vehicles to keep the momentum up, because we all saw that the sales of electric vehicles came down a little last year because subsidies also came down. I also read just now before the meeting that parallel with that, China will also use its incentive scheme to keep pressure on China to increase the development of higher density batteries and to reduce the energy consumption of the electric vehicles. And finally, as was said already, China will continue to stimulate its economy in these times through infrastructure investments, and much of that will go to more modern infrastructure, for example, such as charging. I think that gives a sort of a glimpse of what's happening in China on the electric vehicle side.
Thank you. You are both, well, you are in Gothenburg, Thomas, and Mats, you're from Sweden somewhere, I don't know where.
I'm from Malmö.
Yeah, working in China, whereas Polestar is also manufactured in China. So you're all both connected to Sweden and China. Anyway, how do you see the difference between, let's say, Europe and China when it comes to tackling the crisis and the crisis or the recovery packages and how they are discussing this? You were touching upon it, Mats, but do you have any views on how it's different?
Well, perhaps that's a bit early to say, because China was earlier in the phase of being affected by the corona crisis. So we see now China may be coming out of the economic shutdown, and people now say that the economy is back to some 80% in general in China. And we see that domestic consumption is a very strong driver of the economy. What may hold back the Chinese economy is that imports needed for its growth may be restricted because of economic slowdown in the West. Then, of course, China has its huge, it has a habit of using huge stimulus packages to grow its economy. Now we see, of course, huge packages being launched in the West as well, in a way that we have never seen before. So from that point of view, it seems like also Western economies are now using the kind of stimulus that we've only seen in China before. So maybe they are more similar than dissimilar.
And Thomas, what is your view on this? Your production is already started, which is good news. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I went through the full cycle there in a way. When we were here in Gothenburg at the Green Car Expo, I still was very heavily asked about the factory in China being shut down and what big problem that was. Now, a couple of weeks later, I'm in the comfortable position of saying, yes, our factory had started already. Now we are starting here as well in Sweden again. So that was just a catch-up time. I think that the whole question of how this can affect EV market, COVID-19, has the three aspects to it: industry, the politics, and the consumer. To me, the most interesting point is actually consumer side, because the consumer has a and there, to me, is the biggest difference between China and Europe. In Europe, people are generally much more afraid of change and much more afraid of new things coming and how much that would challenge all the nice status quo and life that we all enjoy. And of course, COVID-19 has brought a psychology element into it, where people are forced now to actually experience a dramatic change in their life. And on one hand, of course, cope with the difficulties, but as well experience that we can cope, and that actually life, despite all the drama that there's as well positive experiences in it, experiencing change. And there I have some hope that that experience of this crisis indeed will be a good learning in terms of, come on, certain changes in life are possible and necessary, and they do not mean the end of the world for us. So therefore, I hope of a positive effect from that psychology point of view. Politicians, I mean, Jesus, of course, we need the journey of the electrification, just like we see it in China, like we see it in Norway. You need a certain frame for electric mobility to prosper and to really have a chance to be successful. And the industry, my God, to go back now, and as I heard one of the colleagues saying, oh, hopefully we can be as quick as possible back to normal. I had to laugh a little bit when we just had kind of launched this campaign, Goodbye Normal. That was exactly the opposite. Yes, how quickly could we go back to normal? I mean, we have seen all the positives effect of blue sky and clearer water and everything now. So of course, to just go back to normal, do we really want that? Of course, we have to get the industry started again, and we cannot all think that we can have blue sky and clear water with unemployment and stuff. Of course, we have to get back to an industry working, but in harmony and in better harmony. And we have, despite the fact of electromobility, such a long journey still ahead to come to really a sustainable life. So again, back to what I said, it's just a start. And my God, let's finally start with it and get to the next steps.
And just quickly, we met in January when you visited Oslo, and we of course have moved a little bit further when it comes to the rest of Europe. And I must say, you had invited all the people that had pre-ordered the Polestar 2, and I saw a lot of gray-haired men. So it's not like people can't change. There were a lot of gray-haired men, like my Jan here. He actually just bought his first electric car, not an early adopter in Norway, but he just bought his daughter's electric car. Isn't that true, Jan?
I inherited my daughter's electric vehicle, yes.
And it's on Leaf, wasn't it?
It's a beautiful car.
Yeah, right.
But a question.
A link to our webpage.
A question to both of you. We always hear about the bottlenecks that you have as an industry. Either it's battery supply or other types of bottlenecks. How will that have changed when we get back over the pandemic? Will they be the same? Do you have bottlenecks, or will they have shifted to something else?
Well, if I start, the funny thing was that I was in Sweden at the Chinese New Year, and then the corona crisis broke out in China. And we worried very much first at Scania about our supply chains in China. But they managed, actually. And then what got the automotive industry in Europe to halt was, of course, the European supply chains that, due to various reasons, had to stop down. When we go back and look now at the supply chains in China, it turns out that they are very efficient and very sturdy. So the worry that many had that China would lose out as a consequence of the corona crisis, I think the jury is still out if China will be a loser. I think they may continue to be a very strong supply chain for the automotive industry. I think what we need to look at in the European industry is, of course, just in time is a very good principle to save money, but it also makes the system very vulnerable. Because China's further away, of course, there were more buffers in the system towards Europe. So something needs to be done to look at how can we make the systems sturdier to withhold future disturbances, whatever they may be.
Yeah,
Yes,
you can,
yeah. Go on.
I can only underline what Mats just explained. Indeed, the supply chain is now much more the question, how much can we secure whatever we have coming from Europe and make sure that this is not hindering the production, which indeed in China is pretty much in a good shape. Transportation, I mean, that is another thing that, of course, us being dependent on the materials flowing in a good, fast way from around the world. And I mean, not flying, I mean, ships, trains, everything. And here, of course, we are very dependent on this still all being possible and open. That, of course, we have to really monitor.
Mats, a question to you. You're in the heavy-duty line. What about hydrogen as a carrier of energy? Is that on your radar at all?
Well, in China, it is now an area where the authorities want to prioritize it. And this goes back to what I said, leapfrogging technologically. Some Chinese leaders went to Japan and saw that several Japanese manufacturers were favoring fuel cells over battery vehicles, and went back home and said, why haven't we done that? So now a lot of money is spent on that. But the fuel cell technology will only take off when we have enough energy to produce the hydrogen needed for these solutions. So why is it then happening in China? Well, one reason is that China invested in a number of wind power plants in Western China that never were connected to the grid. So now some people see the opportunity to use that power to produce hydrogen, and then could be fed into hydrogen vehicles. But we are a long way from that being commercially viable, but a lot of money goes into that development in China today.
And your competitor Nikola in the US will be running their big trucks this year, I guess, on hydrogen.
Yeah, that's what we hear, and I think everyone is looking into this and is working hard on it. The question is, when does it become an economic solution that we can sell commercially? That's what we're all striving for.
Okay.
Are you? Let's move on to the issue of charging a little bit. Thomas, you are not. Have you been focusing on this new thing with electric cars, which is really charging, which is the new thing, entering as a sort of a newcomer in a market where Tesla already has a lot of infrastructure all over the world, really, at least in Europe and the US, and you have not joined Ionity, the Ionity network either. Do you think? Looking back at the slides that Colin showed initially, we see that, of course, there are more and more charging infrastructure being implemented. Are you worried that this will be, will be a drawback for you, not having the infrastructure in place the same way as your competitors that have been in place longer?
No, it's just a complete different situation that we are facing than somebody who was introducing electromobility, let's say 5 years ago, because indeed at that point in time, if you wanted to be successful with offering electric mobility, you had to provide the charging. think now at that point in time, it would be crazy if each and every brand would introduce their own charging structure. We have to a situation where this is free access for everybody, and we need a charging infrastructure that is accessible, independent what brand you drive. That is what we will be offering our customers as the best information of where charging is at that point in time possible, the easiest and most comfortable access to it. And this is what we are working on that. And that is a very local question, and it's nothing that you can Europe-wide answer. You need a very specific answer for Norway, for Sweden. You even need a very specific answer, even depending on the local area. You might have here in Gothenburg a different situation than in Stockholm, what type of access you need. So for that reason, us coming into the market today, we definitely will support and work for our customers in that direction that we need, and provides charging infrastructure that is as easy, accessible as possible.
And we have a lot of participants from all over the world here today actually listening in, and you already told us that Norway is a prioritized market and your first space was opened in Oslo. Could you say a little bit about how you're planning to go on when it comes to opening up I don't know, we call it spaces, shops or whatever.
Yeah, that's our term.
In other countries, and when will, could you tell us a little bit about your plans?
This is a very exciting year in that respect, that from this, you could call it prototypes, the space in Oslo and the space in Beijing that we opened last year. Now this year, really, up to 50 spaces we will be opening, and the plan and the locations are now all being bit by bit published. We just showed where we will be in Gothenburg and in Norway, but at the same time, the 20 spaces in China, in the US, all this is now being installed and will be opened over the period between June, October. I mean, this kind of 4 or 5 months that we have to really be then present in the big cities in the world.
Thomas, a final question from me. You've built a brand new brand, the Polestar brand, but you have heritage from Volvo. You're ready to deliver cars. What are the learnings from that kind of side operation? What did you get from doing it with Volvo as an owner, and what did it give you to have the freedom of a new brand? I'm curious.
We very often have that question about how much are we a startup and not, because of course with the 2 big parents in the background, it is a different kind of startup than what you normally describe. But one thing that I really have to point of view, we can be and we are that much faster in certain decision making, certain freedom to move forward much more in speed and time. That is a very great experience and difference to the time working here building the cars for the brand Volvo. So there is lots of learnings that I could take from it, but to really have now that much more speed in all of it is a very enjoyable experience.
Okay, we have to end pretty soon, but before that, I'd like to just very quickly hear: are you both Mats and Thomas? Are you positive about the future?
Well, absolutely. But I think when a crisis like this happens, it reveals weaknesses in society and in industry, and now we can look at those and improve them. And I think we're coming out to a much better world once we're over this crisis.
Yeah, I support that point of view as well. For a very simple observation, I mean, just really how us as a company, how we go through it, how we experience on one hand the strengths that we actually gained also staying together in this crisis, and the positive spirit that despite all worries is amongst that. I think that is generally, you can transfer that to society and what society will how come out of this crisis. So yes, very positive.
Great. Thank you for now, and thank you for everyone that was listening. Jan and I are definitely going out of this studio and into the Oslo sun now. And I hope all of you are safe and sound wherever you are around the world.
Hope to see you soon again. Thank you.